My name is Patch. I'm an award-winning writer, a published cartoonist, and apparently, this is a story about the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. When I was a kid, I loved comic books. I still do. I got my first comic when I was 3 years old, and it was an issue of Action Comics that featured Superman fighting a villain named the Purple Piledriver. The Purple Piledriver shot things out of the top of his helmet. At 3, I was too young to know what a double entendre was. I've long had a theory that kids who are really into comics will eventually try their hand at making them. I was no different. When I was younger, I took notebook paper, a pencil, and some crayons, and I did a multi-issue run of Avengers. And this was the 70s. It was before the Avengers were cool. I also did a series about Pac-Man, who wore a cape and was a superhero. And this was before the Super Pac-Man video game or cartoon. Even into my adult life, I would try to make comics. I'd always get a couple of pages into it and then lose interest. Then one night, sitting outside a local bar, I had a comic story idea land fully formed in my head. The next day I sat down at my dining room table and started drawing it. When I was finished a couple of months later, I had a complete 90-page story in my hands. This was 10 years ago this year. The story was titled Monster Truck, and it was about Lupe, a werewolf who owned a food truck. Lupe was offered his dream job, being an executive chef at a fancy restaurant. His dream job, though, ended up being a nightmare when he found out his employer was actually a Lovecraftian monster who hired him to cook children. With the help of his friends, Gil, his roommate and a fellow cook, Hazel, his girlfriend and a witch, and Pops, a human hot dog vendor, Lupe managed to rescue a bunch of kids, rob his employer of his powers, and defeat him in battle using a giant mech. The story had a lot of influences. I uploaded it to the internet as a webcomic and a couple dozen people read it. It was fun. It felt like the scratching of a lifelong itch. And then it was over, or so I thought. One night it dawned on me as I was laying in bed, the events of this story weirdly foreshadowed future events in my life. I lay there piecing it all together like the detective at the end of The Usual Suspects, and as the metaphoric Kobayashi mug fell from my hands and shattered on the floor, I shot up immediately in bed. I relayed my new discovery to my wife and asked her to confirm my uncanny discovery. Was I crazy? But she confirmed my life had taken an oddly similar trajectory to the story. When I was making the comic, I worked in a large church in their video production department, a job I loudly and often proclaimed to be my dream job. My wife was pregnant at the time, and her pregnancy sent me into a tailspin of religious doubt. I wasn't sure if I wanted to bring up my soon-to-be-born child as a Christian. After months of therapy and soul-searching, I left my faith and my job at the church. So, not wanting my child to be part of something that felt to me like a child sacrifice, I left the church, robbing an ancient god of his power over me, and I left my dream job. At some point in all that, my wife's interest became what could be described as definitively witchy. Despite the lack of giant mechs, this confluence was striking to me. The story that dropped into my head one night that I spent months toiling over ended up predicting, causing future events in my life. In the title of this video, I referred to what happened as a hypersigil. Hypersigil was a term coined by Grant Morrison. Morrison is a popular comic book writer. In the 2000s, he wrote a series for DC Comics called The Invisibles. The lead character of The Invisibles, a man named King Mob, was based on Morrison. As the series continued over its 6-year run, Morrison, a practicing chaos magician, realized what happened to King Mob in the stories ended up also happening to him, even going so far as he and the character catching a flesh-eating staph virus and bursting a lung. He ended up calling this phenomenon a hypersigil because it seemed like an expanded, enlarged version of sigil magic, a method used by chaos magicians to affect reality. I've considered a lot of possible explanations for what really happened. For a while, I compared what happened to Carl Jung's idea of the transcendent function. But now, 10 years later, I'm not really convinced there's any difference between a hypersigil and Jung's transcendent function. I decided at one point it was just a coincidence. But if it was a coincidence that held great meaning for me, making it basically a Jungian synchronicity. If it's not obvious, I find Jung's general metaphysic helpful for explaining things. But again, I'm not really sure if there's a big difference between a hypersigil and a synchronicity. So yeah, 10 years out, that's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. And all the explanations I come up with to explain it just make it weirder.